Taoiseach, last February the Minister for the Environment, Alan Kelly, confirmed that the Government is proposing a statutory framework which will introduce a rent certainty for up to 4 years. And all throughout the year, month by month, Minister Kelly is quoted as saying he's going to bring an end to rent instability. He's going to bring rent certainty, he's going to bring proposals before Cabinet, he's going to tackle the spiralling rents. It's now his #1 priority. And he said he's expecting legislation by the end of the year. In June we read that he wants to tie rent increases to inflation, to bring in temporary rent controls, to assist families who are under huge pressures and who are being made homeless on a month-by-month basis. In September we get leaks and headlines from Fine Gael sources, senior cabinet ministers saying it will not happen, that they're against Minister Kelly's plan. Worryingly, in response, in a kind of Jose Marino type response, he goes into third person and he attacks the cowards, the anonymous cowards that are briefing against him. He's talking about his colleagues, Fine Gael senior ministers he's talking about. But meanwhile, Taoiseach, as all this infighting goes on, we read all the headlines, AK-47 versus Buddha, and the former Minister of Finance, who's nodding silently and sagely, and so on like that. Meanwhile, the numbers, 1,500 children in emergency accommodation, threshold saying that the numbers of families will rise who are homeless will go from 700 to 1,000 by Christmas. And the indecision is creating further instability in the rental market, with people shoving up the rents to get in ahead of whatever proposals are going to emerge from Cabinet. NESC is saying that well-designed rent certainty proposals can bring about a lot of stability to the market,
please. Thank you.
and can bring about a degree of certainty, and is somewhat concerned by some of the leaks from the Fine Gael side in relation to the dissing on the whole rent certainty, rent control agenda. And fundamentally the question is, Taoiseach, going back to the commitment of last February, that we would see legislation by the end of the year. The budget has passed but nothing proposed. Will we see legislation shortly that will bring about the rent certainty that the Minister has staked his reputation on and has said is something that he regards as his #1 priority and something he wants to introduce? Or is the story in today's Irish Independent that his plans are dead in the water?
Well, we've referred to this on a number of occasions here in the recent past. There are a whole number of issues that need to be dealt with in respect of the housing situation generally, both in respect of homelessness, either rough sleepers or those who do not have a place to stay because they're homeless or they're being put out of accommodation that they've got. A great deal of work has gone on in respect of most of that, and what I want to say to you is that the Minister for Finance and the Minister for the Environment had a very good meeting yesterday. They're discussing a number of issues, Deputy Martin, in respect to the short term that need to be attended to, and in the longer term. As I said on many occasions, the real problem here is the lack of supply of housing, and government are looking at a range of options there that can't take place overnight to provide the many houses that are needed. Suffice it to say that yesterday we had discussions which were very progressive, I have to say, in respect of modular housing, the numbers of voids that have been returned to habitable accommodation, the targets set for the social housing objectives of the local authorities, the fact that the ministers called them all in and told them to get on with that, and the renovations that are taking place throughout Dublin in particular. I expect that the progress made in respect of rough sleepers in particular is one that will be able to be met in the case of a bad winter. 130 beds opened extra this year, further 130 to be opened now, and the money in place to deal with that. So I expect that the people who are working in respect of the rough sleeping element of the population that is in Dublin in particular can be dealt with. I expect that and hope that the Minister for the Environment and the Minister for Finance can conclude on the discussions that they're having about what needs to be done in the short term and what needs to be put in place for the medium, longer term to deal with the supply of housing. I hope they can conclude that this week, Deputy Martin.
Taoiseach, you hope they can conclude it? Like, we've had a budget. It's chaotic what's going on. Absolute chaotic. In terms of two ministers, they had a good meeting yesterday. We're all supposed to breathe a sigh of relief. after all the kind of leaks and counter-leaks and the antagonism of the last 2 months on this question. It's going back to last February, and I asked you a simple question. Minister Kelly said there would be legislation last September on this issue. He said he would link rent controls rent increases to the CPI index, to inflation. We're almost at the anniversary of the death of Jonathan Corrie 12 months ago, Taoiseach, when this Dáil was appalled at that development and at the whole issue around homelessness. And all that has happened over the last 12 months, it's got progressively worse. And any TD who's in a clinic with young families coming in who have absolutely no certainty of where they're going to be housed next week, it's a shocking indictment of your leadership, Taoiseach, and of the government's lack of cohesion, of any focus or sense of purpose, or any policy in relation to homelessness. All we get is the Minister for the Environment calling Fine Gaelers a load of cowards.
Sorry.
And they calling him Calamity Kelly.
Question, please.
That's what we're getting in the media on a week-by-week basis. Yet families are coming to us saying, can you do something for us? I'm 3 nights in a hotel this week, and I'm 3 nights in self-catering apartments after that, and the welfare officer is saying I have only €700 to pay out. It's that bad, Taoiseach. And the rents are increasing and have been spiralling out of control, which basically means that families have been evicted as we speak.
Thank you.
And as the government continues with the pseudo-warfare going on through the media, in the absence of any coherence or any single-minded sort of purposeful policy initiative. The budget was silent. Both ministers, Noonan and Powell, were silent on this issue for an entire budgetary speech. And one of the most basic obligations of a state, Taoiseach, is to put a roof over people's heads. Will there be legislation, Taoiseach, or not before the end of this Dáil session?
Thank you.
And can you confirm whether the plan to link rent increases to inflation is now dead in the water? Is that going to happen, or is it not?
Taoiseach, thank you.
I said to you that I hope that the discussions between the Minister for Finance and the Minister for the Environment can be concluded satisfactorily this week. They will deal with a number of matters in the shorter term. And obviously you have to put in place arrangements to deal with the provision and the supply of housing for the medium to longer term. The Minister did change the regulations, as you're aware, in respect of the HAP programme, which I think allows for an increase in rent to be made available by subsistence from the Department of Social Protection, which gives certainty of tenancy to that category that are under serious pressure here. And in respect of the modular housing, which is already now underway with a start for sites that have been identified here in Dublin. The real problem, I take your point, I had many examples of people who are under serious pressure in terms of rent being increased by landlords. They're not all pressurising people, because there's a humanity there too in many cases that I'm aware of. But clearly the situation is not the way we want it to be. There was a total collapse of the housing sector here from 100,000, 90,000 units down to less than 8. Obviously, there are issues that need to be addressed in the immediate term in respect of landlords, in respect of the rent situation, and the ministers are talking about that, and I hope they can conclude those discussions this week. Clearly, the situation insofar as the supply of housing, which deals with all of this, is critical, and it's not possible to deal with it, just overnight. It may well be that legislation will be required, and if it is required, it will be introduced.
Thank you.
It will be introduced. I'd make the point, Deputy Martin, that on the other end of the scale, you're having announcement after announcement about job investment and investment in the country here, and this is obviously creating pressure in other areas in respect of accommodation, both commercial and residential. That doesn't solve the problem of the person under pressure this evening, but the changes made by the Minister already in respect of the short term are beneficial, they're helpful, they're not the answer, but we hope that we can conclude those discussions this week.
Thank you. Deputy Doherty on behalf of Sinn Féin.
Taoiseach, on 3 separate occasions now, you have claimed that your government was on the brink of deploying the troops onto our streets and introducing capital controls. You told a Fine Gael fundraiser in October, and I'll quote you, you said the head of the central bank came in on a Wednesday and said, I have to tell you, Taoiseach, that it's probably likely that you will have to put the army around the ATM machines on Friday. We may well have to print money. We may well have to introduce capital controls. End of quote. On the 20th of October, Taoiseach, you told the Dáil a similar story. And 2 days later, on the 22nd of October, you repeated this tall tale to a meeting of the European People's Party in Madrid. Now, Taoiseach, we all know that there was contingency plans in place. We've read about them in Pat Leahy's book, The Price of Power, and the banking inquiry has been told by the former General Secretary of the Department of Finance that these contingency plans were developed before your time in office and continue to be developed during your time. But what you're claiming is something very, very different. Both inside and outside this chamber, you're claiming that in the estimation of the Governor of the Central Bank, a moment had come when he thought it necessary to suggest to you, as the Taoiseach, to put those plans into action. And you've given the impression that somehow within 48 hours you thwarted disaster and you saved us all from the catastrophe. Now, Taoiseach, before we start erecting statues to your glory, can you finally clarify some matters to the Dáil and to the citizens? And they are: what was the event that led Professor Honohan on that Wednesday to suggest to you deploying streets on the streets of this state on that Friday? When exactly was that week that you are talking about, and how was this issue resolved?
Thank you. Taoiseach.
Well, first of all, I note your comment about fundraisers. It shows you the extent of the priority that your leader and deputy leader attach to this House, that they decide to exit to the United States for a fundraiser, which was very much in excess of any that I might have attended myself. Secondly, Deputy, there will be no statues to my glory or otherwise. If that's where your interest lies, then don't talk to me, please. I'm happy to outline the context in which all of this happened. And the reality is, as you well know, that for a prolonged period in 2011 and 2012, there was a massive instability in the Eurozone with the economic circumstances that applied in a number of countries. And people were openly questioning whether the currency would actually survive in its current form. And that's why I make no apology to anybody, no apology, for putting in place, as head of government, with the agencies of government, contingency plans to deal with the possibility of a total collapse of the euro currency. It would have been grossly irresponsible and grossly negligent, Count Corla, of the government not to have done so in the face of clear warnings and signs that were there, being blocked from capital markets, money flying from the country and so on like that. Obviously, it wasn't appropriate to make any of the contingency plans that were being put in place public at that time for very good reasons, and even today it's not appropriate to provide the details of that particular work. Those contingency plans, as everybody knows, as a small open economy, we are dependent upon exports and imports, and we would have been particularly vulnerable to a breakup of the euro. And those contingency plans, Deputy Doherty, covered policy issues, legislation, logistics, security, the role of the banking sector, international relations and communication to the Irish public. Emergency structures to manage that crisis, to be overseen by government, were designed very carefully and would have been activated by necessary. That work was carried on in secret, Count Corla, by a small number of officials from the Department of Finance, the Department of the Taoiseach, the Central Bank and the National Treasury Management Agency. And given the scale of what might have happened, which I'm thankful didn't happen, the full resources of the state would have been mobilised, including the Gardaí and the Defence Forces. It's always obvious that in a change from one currency to a weaker currency, or in a changed currency, that these things, including capital controls, are always discussed. It would have been necessary to pass emergency legislation, providing exceptional powers to the local authorities. And while it's not appropriate to give the details of the contingency plans, Count Corla, the issues considered would have clearly dealt with producing and supplying and circulating a new currency, supplying essential supplies of fuel, electricity and medicines and so on, the normal running of any country. And it was absolutely appropriate that those discussions around those contingency plans took place. And at the end of all of that, had it happened, it could have happened very quickly. So, Deputy, as as the Governor himself said, we don't talk about the details of discussions that took place here, but there were those discussions that took place between Finance, the Department of Taoiseach, the Central Bank and the NTMA about very serious indications that it might have been necessary to introduce those contingency plans. I'm glad it didn't happen, and we're now in a very different spot than we were back in those days of early 2011 and 2012.